But there are only 9 owners of the news racks. There are many publications that go into the news racks, but we needed to determine who is responsible for those news racks and who would we be permitting for the permitting end of things on the news racks. So ownership of these news racks for these entities varies from some own as little as 2 to some own over 260, at least at last count. And so we have this software that we have used that has been that we can take inventory and pictures, etc., and GPS location for these news racks. And we also have had installed our labels or stickers to identify each individual news rack so that when they become registered, they'll have a registration number. This is a photo of our plan of the El Pueblo Viejo district, and it shows you that we have, that's a special district in our news rack ordinance, and that it contains a number of news racks, and it also contains the 18 city cabinets. I'll show a picture of that in a second, but they're the green cabinets that house multiple news rack boxes. And so this is the only district in which those city-owned news racks are located. So there are 18 cabinets. 14 of them are those green metal cabinets, the style that's shown here on your left. And then 4 of them are what I call the masonry cabinets. But you can see the individual boxes that are placed inside of those. And those are owned by the news rack owners. Let me go back. So again, there are different news rack types, and so we also, I'll get into the boards and commissions in a moment. So one of the outcomes that we have been striving to achieve here is that there would be regular monitoring and management of the news racks. Public Works has historically managed these news racks on a complaint basis, and so we recognize the need to do a more proactive management so that we can try and level that playing field, because we do have a number of news racks that are being maintained and managed appropriately and some that aren't. And so we were wanting to improve our ordinance so that we would have a registration and permitting process, actively pursuing that. And then an important element would be that there would be insurance provided by the news rack owners so that they would be insured, similar to our outdoor dining licenses, so that there would be insurance for that in the event there was an incident. And then, of course, the fees to be established for the cost recovery. And we did go to the Finance Committee. I did go to make a presentation to the Finance Committee on May the 5th, and the Finance Committee had agreed upon the suggested fees, and the next slide will show that. So we also have another need in the city, and that is some of the news racks are sitting on a rack called a pedestal rack, where these boxes are sitting on a pedestal, and those pedestals, we could not find the owner of the pedestals. So there's some speculation they were put in one of the first racks to be put in the city, and so there is no clear ownership of them. The city has declared that the city does not own them. So as part of the registration process, if they are to remain, we would like the news rack owners to claim ownership of the pedestals that they intend to use. And so one of the bottom lines of all of this is that the existing news racks would be maintained and painted as appropriate or identified for maintenance. We've done a complete inventory at the time. We'll do another one once we get the news racks registered. And I'll get into that in a minute. So with regards to fees, so the top 2 that are lined out, that is our existing fee resolution fiscal year 2015. So we're proposing to substitute those fees with new fees that are directly related to what we are trying to accomplish. Let me explain that. The annual fee is proposed fee is $13 per box. That would apply to all the boxes that would be registered. So if 770 were registered, it would apply to that. So that would generate a revenue of approximately $9,000 or $9,000 plus, depending on the number that will end up being registered. So that is the amount that staff intends to use for the management and administration of this program. So we feel that's adequate for our intents and purposes for what we had planned to do, because we've already taken one inventory and we would be updating the inventory in future iterations. And so that is the fee that we anticipate would be an annual fee ongoing, subject to the increases. I'll talk to that in a minute. So in addition to the $13 a box, we've identified another fee, which is an additional fee for the ones that are in the city cabinets. For the cabinets, the city owns and maintains, and so we don't have a current budget to maintain those cabinets. We thought it would be fair and appropriate for the users to contribute to having those cabinets maintained and painted. So we've assigned an additional $18 a box for those. And so that there are approximately 58 boxes that go into those 18 cabinets, so that would generate approximately $1,000 a year of revenue. And then over time, we would have enough revenue to paint those boxes. And so the painting of those cabinets cost approximately $500, so we anticipate approximately every 10 years for them to be painted. So this revenue source would then pay for the painting of the city cabinets. And we've compared these fees to other agencies, and we found them to be comparable. And maybe whoever's in the audience that represent the owners of the news racks could even elaborate on other agencies, because you've got City of Carpinteria, other agencies in the vicinity that they may be paying fees to as well. So we went to the Architectural Board of Review twice and the Historic Landmarks Commission twice, to the ABR on February 2nd and April 27th, and to the HLC on February 11th and May the 6th. And of course, we went to them wanting their input on the aesthetics and the issues that they were concerned about related to news racks. And so we got some very good comments from them. Generally speaking, they both agreed upon a Malaga green color for the news racks. And the only area where they differed in their recommendation was on those pedestals. And here's an example of those pedestals. These are there may be several of these boxes on a rack, I call a pedestal, and they share that pedestal. And so for the Historic Landmarks Commission, they preferred to have all green, including the pedestals, and the ABR has selected black as the color for the pedestal instead of the green. So that was the difference in the color. But they also selected the styles. And so the standard in the industry is pretty much the K-Jack style, which this one is, I believe, is a representative or sample of. And so this being the K-Jack 100 style, and it has a single door, and this is one in relatively new condition. Another picture of another one. And then this is a picture of the K-Jack 125 style, because it has two doors. So that's another style that the ABR and the HLC has approved. And then these are the box style. It's called the K-Jack 50 style. So they go into the city cabinets. And so these three styles were selected by the ABR and HLC as the new style. Now, let me explain that a little bit. The existing news racks that are out there today, when they need to be replaced, then they need to be replaced with one of these three styles. So we're not asking the news rack owners at this time to go out there and replace all their news racks. We understand that there's a significant cost associated with that, but we're also understanding that there may not, it's a case-by-case basis of whether they need to be replaced or not. Our staff will, through our inventory, we will go through and identify the racks that need painting, maintenance, and repair. And then if we may make a recommendation for them to be replaced, but the cost for their replacement will be borne by the news rack owner. And they may be willing to choose when they get replaced. But certainly if there is a need to replace them, we'll be working with them to get them replaced. And if they are replaced, they'll be replaced with this new style. So again, getting back to the pedestals, you can see in town, I'm seeing more and more where there's gaps in the pedestals because some of the news racks have been pulled off for various reasons. I expect that perhaps the anticipation of the extra fees that are, or the fees that are they're being charged, maybe one of, and maybe the news rack owners who are here today could speak to that. But point being here is that in town we see that there are some gaps in the existing pedestals. So the pedestals, again, are not, the city is not responsible for those. And so if the news rack owners would like to register their racks and the pedestals, they will be allowed to remain. If no one claims ownership of the pedestals, then Public Works would be removing those pedestals, and those boxes, like the one in the bottom right picture, actually all of them, they would need to be standalone boxes, or they would need to come up with a pedestal that they would get permitted. So we have an issue here of less use of the pedestals, yet no one claiming ownership of them. So we intend to solve that by having the pedestals be registered with the news racks. Okay. So again, our next steps then is we've got the scheduled to have an introduction of the ordinance at the council in 2 weeks if we do get an approval here today, and then acceptance of the ordinance 2 weeks later. Then we would ask once we got the ordinances in effect, we would ask for the owners to register their news racks, and the registration would be at no cost. We would, because we have an inventory of what we believe is out there. It may need to be updated, and we'll work with them to update it. But we are not planning to charge for the registration of the news racks. We feel that's something that they've been working with us, and we will work with them to get accomplished. And then within 90 days after registration, then we would ask them to fix the racks that have been identified to be fixed. By that I mean if it needs painting, that they would need to paint them. And so for the owners of the news racks who have less than 30 racks, we would expect compliance within 90 days. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are some news rack owners who own hundreds. So it would be very challenging for them to have compliance within 90 days. So we would ask them to submit an implementation plan, perhaps quarterly or whatever we can agree to, for the racks for the owners that have more than 30 racks. And then we'll work with them for an implementation plan with the expectation, though, of compliance within 1 year, July 1st of 2016. And I've been working closely with the news rack owners and their stakeholders group, because some of these fees have to be passed on to whomever is paying to have their materials put into the news racks. And so we've had many collaborative meetings. I want to personally thank Mr. Joe Cole and his staff, Scott Copeland especially. They have taken a very active role in helping get our issues to the table, and for having the groups have work sessions together. They even hosted a meeting for us at their location so that we can try and get all the players together. And there have been a couple non-participants. We have sent notifications and calls and emails, etc., and some people just have not participated. But we believe that we have 90-something% participation of the owners that have provided input into this ordinance update. And then I do want to acknowledge Ms. Wright. Ms. Wright has been one of the catalysts for several years now, and I believe she's got a speaker slip, but I want to thank her for her participation as a private citizen. She's lit the fire, one of the fires, and we're moving forward as a result of a lot of her efforts as well. With that, I conclude my presentation. And, one more thing, please. This morning, Mr. Cole and I had a discussion about some potential minor changes or editing that we would agree to in the ordinance. And I'm not sure if we can get your approval today and follow up with some suggested minor edits, as long as it doesn't change the scope and the intent or the meaning of what is being intended. And Mr. Cole, I believe, intends to speak a little bit to that. And so if necessary, we can return. But if it is allowable, then maybe we would request that we be allowed to edit this prior to the City Council meeting. And the edits would need to meet the approval of the Public Works Department and the City Attorney's Office.
Okay, great. Let's hear the questions from the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm curious about the changes that you're talking about. I did read the ordinance. What is it, 2 or 3 pages, or is it a long list? I know you said they're minor.
I think it's a handful or so of items that would, Mr. Cole and I are saying we could have perhaps made some things a little more clear, so that it's for clarification or edification purposes, but not to change the intent. And I think Mr. Cole, if he doesn't mind explaining some of his concerns, because we went over them on the phone this morning. So it's a last-minute thing for us, but However, whatever the best procedure is to address this, that's what we need to discuss as well.
Mr. Cole's going to speak, so maybe he'll address those. Do you have any other questions?
I did. Thank you. Do we want to settle that question first?
As you wish.
Okay. Mr. Kalan.
Chair Hodges, Councilmember Murillo. It depends what the changes are. We can have them read into the record today, and if they're minor enough, we can make them on the fly. If they require some thought and further editing, we'll want to come back to you.
Right. Well, let's hear what they are first. Do you have any other
Okay.
questions?
Just my other question, in reading about the design review boards, there was some talk about there shouldn't be any kind of advertising or banner names or something like that. But I can see right now in this photo there does seem to be some lettering on the news racks. Did you work out those details about? And then on another one of your like that, I could see the Sentinel name there. Will that be acceptable, or what have you worked out in terms of monikers?
The discussions that we had with the ABR and the HLC was that the cleaner the better was the tone of the discussions, but they did recognize the need to have the names of the owners on there, especially the contact information. So that was simpler. But we do have so on the left with the Sentinel, we discourage things like that.
Right.
There's a way to get the name on there without it being as large. But on the right here, we have like I think it's called a card. Is that the term for it? A card that can be interchangeable, and sometimes during the fiesta there may be a But the bottom line is that what staff is supporting is that there not be a third party or advertising such that it's used for purposes other than the news rack. So
Identification.
it's
simply.
identification,
Okay.
and we would try to make it subtle because our direction from the boards and commissions was to make it cleaner, not to make it more cluttered.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And maybe in public comment we'll hear more about that. Thank you, Mr. Owaziak.
So let's go to public comment now. First, Ms. Elizabeth Wright, please. Just a minute.
Good afternoon. Hi, I've been
Thank you very much. Joe Cole, please. You're running out of time, and what you have to say is important. So keep going. Let's hear what you got. Okay.
I'm sorry, so the pedestals, we're probably going to get off the pedestals. Those are those long things with about 4 racks because someone's going to take ownership of them. The city doesn't own them now. We want to have our own standalone racks so that we're not subject to someone raising the rent that we would have to pay on those pedestals. Very quickly, the rack card, that's what he meant to refer to. At the bottom, there's that. Usually it says Santa Barbara Independent or News Press, but sometimes it may say Film Festival or Fiesta, something like that. Happy to answer any questions.
You have any questions?
Well, I'm a little bit curious. I know the Daily Sound had a presence here a few years ago, and I understand it's a mystery how some of the pedestals are unclaimed. Does it matter where they came from? I guess we have a plan going forward. Any thoughts on that, Mr. Cole?
The pedestals aren't owned by anybody, right? They go up, they go over. The city doesn't want to own them in case somebody gets hurt. The individual news organizations own the boxes.
Okay.
So I think the ordinance says if the pedestals aren't filled, if they don't look pretty, the city's going to take them away. And we need to be able to get our newspaper out to people without worrying about the pedestals. So it's kind of a mystery. We had long discussions about what if you have 3 boxes up there now, who owns the pedestal? What if one leaves? We're just going to opt out of that entire discussion.
Thank you.
Don Kadich, please, from the News Press.
Thank you, Chairman. Council members. I'm Don Kadich, Director of News Operations with the Santa Barbara News Press. And first of all, let me state the News Press is certainly supportive of trying to make Santa Barbara a prettier place. However, we do have some significant concerns in the draft ordinance as currently stated. Most significant aspect is that there is no method for appeal on Section 55.66.1, page 12, for removing news racks and vests the final discretion on any hearing in the Public Works Director. This is improper. There needs to be due process and with a separate neutral party to appeal these decisions. To properly understand this significant conflict, understand, as Joe alluded to, the role of any media is to hold those in positions of authority accountable. Empowering a non-elected city employee the power to remove the media without any accountability or recourse is not only inappropriate, but could expose the city to future litigation. The news media and our ability to distribute our product is not like any other business in Santa Barbara. It is protected under the First Amendment, and that includes our ability to distribute the news. Number 2, the blinder section, page 2 of the proposed ordinance, number 6, is vague and overbroad. The ordinance implies that it is to prevent pornographic adult material from being in view. We support this restriction, but instead of implying this protection, make it specific language limiting this section to pornographic adult material is required. Number 3, the draft ordinance requires use of uniform racks in the downtown area to conform to standard street furniture. This may be proper as long as you are imposing the same restrictions to other street furniture. Page 2, item 4 of the draft ordinance states that changes to news racks are in conjunction with requirements to standardize street furniture. If this is true, is there a new street furniture ordinance on the books? I'm unaware of that. Number 4, the burden of funding the actual implementation upkeep associated with the draft ordinance is is by collecting fees from rack owners. The books should be open with regular audits to the stakeholders to ensure rack owners are only paying for this operation and not in excess. Number 5, rack owners have spent
Can
thousands
you
of dollars.
wrap it up pretty quickly here?
Yes. We have spent thousands of dollars conforming to rack changes last decade. The News Press, the largest owner of racks in Santa Barbara, is a primary target of this ordinance. 90 days is not enough time to change or work out a plan that cannot be appealed with staff. The July 1st, 2016 deadline, however, would be the minimum. And lastly, Mr. Cole alluded to minor edits. We certainly support his endeavor for cost protection, but the devil is in the details. We would absolutely want to see those changes before any ordinance is approved. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. That concludes public comment. It's to the Ordinance Committee. I have a question, if I could. Could you address some of what Mr. Kadich, or maybe all of what Mr. Kadich just said, sir?
Yeah, I would like to, Chair Hotchkiss, but it would be helpful if I could ask a couple of questions of Mr. Kadich and perhaps.
Mr. Kadich, could you come up?
My first question was on the harmful matter. And you referred to page 2, was it?
The blinder section?
Yeah.
Yes, item 6.
Do you have a copy of the ordinance?
Yes, I do.
Take a look at page 12 up at the top. The concern was the vagueness of what constitutes harmful matter, and I think we've addressed that by referring to the penal code. And that's a pretty standard approach for blinder racks in the news rack ordinances I've seen.
Yeah, and I did certainly look at that ordinance as well. I think anytime you have an ordinance that potentially might conflict with each other, it's open to interpretation. And thus, the way the draft is written, it falls on one person that cannot be appealed. Our contention is, since that particular item you referred to on page 12 is very specific, make the same specificity on page 2.
Working backwards, then, I share the concern that if we're going to edit the ordinance, we ought to come back to the committee. So given that Mr. Cole didn't have anything specific, I think we will have to come back to the committee with proposed changes. In terms of books being open with regular audits, the city is limited to the cost of service only in these fees, and we have to justify that cost of service. So the books are open. Anytime you wanted to make a request for the supporting data, you could do that. Those numbers are justified by staff. I don't know that they're externally audited, however. I would turn to Assistant City Attorney Ostringer to address whether we feel the need for a separate neutral party in lieu of the Public Works Director making decisions. As I understood the concern, it was that the Public Works Director might be subject of criticism and therefore wouldn't necessarily be a neutral fact finder. Are we on the right track with that?
I would agree with that assessment. There have been recent examples of where entities associated with the city, be it ABR or what have you, have injected their own personal opinion in policy making that was inappropriate.
Well, subject to the committee's desires, I think that's the kind of change that we could make. In other words, to take the decision-making away from the Public Works Director and give it to a neutral party, or else to have an appeal process from the Public Works Director before someone could go to court. It's, I don't know, David, do you want to address that?
At the way it's currently drafted, I think the Public Works Director is subject to some fairly strict limitations on when a rack could be taken away. We do currently have administrative hearing procedures in our municipal code. That's an option I can look at. And it would be someone from a different department that would be making that ultimate decision. the decision, while final from the Public Works Director, could be appealed to the Superior Court through a writ. If the publishers feel they need that extra step in between, I can look into that.
Yeah, I don't think we have to, in the process of ensuring fairness, which is all we're trying to do. I think sometimes simpler is better. Yet, it has certainly been my experience, and I don't know if Mr. Cole could say the same, but the media is treated differently. I'm not saying we're treated better, but we're just treated differently. There are constitutional factors in play, and most training when it comes to public works directors or certain boards do not factor that component in. We have no desire to go to court over these things. I would think with the brain trust within these walls, there would be a way where our concerns could be addressed without the only remedy going to court.
Okay. And as I mentioned, for the benefit of the committee, that's something we'd be happy to look at. I should add that the First Amendment hates discretion on the part of public officials. So the reason being is that improperly used discretion can amount to censorship. So we've tried to draft the ordinance in a way that limits the discretion of the officials that have any decision making to meet those constitutional guidelines that I just mentioned. I would be happy to have my office take another look at that part of the ordinance if that's the committee's pleasure.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry.
Was there anything else, Mr. Cullen?
Yeah, for Mr. Cole, thank you,
Thank
Mr. Kadich. You were rushed for time, I think, and you mentioned rack cards but didn't describe your concern.
Yeah, the concern is we just keep them like we have been, that there's no change there. There's no concern. We just want to make sure that the language in the ordinance is clear, that we can continue to have the same rack cards that we've always had. And really, that's a rack card. Sometimes there's a piece of cardboard put over it that says Fiesta. Read the Fiesta issue. So the rack cards, it's an example of what we want in the ordinance, having it very clear that we can have what we have so that we're not arguing with somebody later about whether the ordinance includes rack cards or not.
Right. Well, I think clarity is what we're after here, and that's why it's written in 12 pages to try to be specific. It's maybe too much Lower East, but that's the way it is right now. Ms. Murillo, you had a question.
Well, while Mr. Cole is up here, do you share the same concern about the power of the Public Works Director being able to?
Yeah, absolutely. As this ordinance has gone through some drafts, the city has tried to cut back on the discretion of the Public Works Director. It clearly needs an appeal. It shouldn't have to go to court on the first appeal. I was thinking that the appeal would be to the City Council, but it can be to a neutral party. So the appealability is something that can be improved in the ordinance. The blind ears.
So you support that?
Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Cole, but let me ask, how often has it happened to the independent that the Public Works Director or the city has removed a rack or wanted to?
We take care of our racks. Never happened.
Okay.
Not to us.
So it hasn't happened. I would ask let me ask staff, how often does it happen that news racks are, if it never happens, then we're but arm wrestling about something.
Well, you asked me about the independent. This ordinance is much tougher. It goes from 4.5 pages to 11.5 pages.
Okay.
I didn't actually think that we needed it. There's been fewer racks than ever.
Right.
On the LA Times, New York Times, they're all gone. So this ordinance gives the city much more power to remove the racks. So I think you need the appeal process. You don't, for First Amendment protections, you don't want the Public Works Director pulling racks off the street. Understood.
And I do support Mr. Kalan and his office then looking at that issue more. And Ms.
Yeah, and I agree with Mr. Kadich's other points on the funding. There's a legal question that we've never had a chance to talk about the ordinance. There's a legal question. There's an indemnification provision in the ordinance that I don't think is right. That's purely a legal question that I wanted to address in the.
And what was that legal question?
The ordinance says, the ordinance has us indemnifying the city if there's an accident. I'm going to oversimplify here. But it says if the city is 10% liable and we're 100% and we're 90% liable, the city's off the hook. Or if let me turn that around. If a RAC owner is 10% liable and the city is 90% liable, comparative negligence, the city's off the hook. It's a wording issue that the city has to be sole and absolutely liable for the entire problem before it has any liability.
Mr. Colon, have you got a response to that?
I don't. I haven't looked at it's the first I've heard of it.
I didn't see it anywhere, but that
I can
doesn't
show you
mean
where
it
it's in
isn't
the
there.
ordinance.
I believe you that it's in
Yeah.
the ordinance. We just haven't had the discussion.
Yeah.
So that's another issue I suppose we should look
Right.
at.
Yeah, I don't believe it's supported by the case law. So,
Thank you very much. Do you have any more questions you would like to or address?
Well, it seems obvious that this needs to go back for some review and coordination with the stakeholders. You all have referred to there's been 90% representation from the stakeholders and 10% not. Is it appropriate to ask who is not cooperating with this process, Mr. Wozniak?
Committee Member Murillo, not sure, not cooperate, well, I guess non-responsive would be the way I would describe that, but I do have a list of some of the owners that aren't here and haven't been.
I think your point is that they just didn't get back to you. It wasn't a matter of cooperation. It's just you never heard back?
Some have attended meetings and haven't provided much input.
I see.
And some have not attended at all, and we haven't heard from them. We've been trying to give them all the information, send them the draft ordinances, et cetera, with no response.
And you think you have a current phone number and for sure they're distributing publications in our community?
Yes, we believe so because their contact information is on the news racks. So we've been utilizing those methods because other than that, we don't have ways to get a hold of them. We've tried, but there's a limit to the search.
Well, maybe with news coverage of this meeting and this issue, they'll come forward and participate, I would hope.
Anything else?
That's it for me. Thank you.
Mr. Cullen, do you have enough? I think we're going to get a motion here from Ms. Murillo shortly, but basically, correct me if I'm wrong, I think her suggestion is that you, in consideration of public comment here, most of which is quite pertinent, that we take another look at this and then come back and talk about it again at the ordinance committee level.
Yes, I think that makes sense. I am cautious not to set the committee up for another delaying effort, so I would like to be able to communicate with Mr. Cole and Mr. Kadich, which we will do directly from my office rather than through staff. And I think we can address the issues that have been raised.
Could we bring this back in 30 days when we have full committee here? Is that too soon?
That would be an outside date as far as I'm concerned. I'd like to get it wrapped up sooner if possible.
All right, so we say as soon as possible then.
That would be appreciated.
Did you have a motion?
Mr. Chair, well, I wanted to, would it help if I attended the meetings of this group so that, would that be helpful?
I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, thank you. I move that we ask our staff and our legal counsel to convene more sessions with the stakeholders and review this ordinance
As soon as possible?
as soon as possible.
I would second that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you very much. We are now adjourned.